name's Ian Horwood, and I'm a senior lecturer in history and war studies here at York St John University. My interests straddle American political and military history, but we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk to Professor Jim Cooper, particularly about his latest book, this one, which is A Diplomatic Meeting, Reagan, Thatcher and the Art of Summitry. Jim is an Associate Professor of History here at YSJ, and he's a recognised expert on the American presidency. And he's written extensively on Anglo-American relations at the highest level during the Cold War and beyond. So, welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for agreeing to have this conversation with me. It's great.
That's my pleasure. I've got a number of questions then that I'd like to try and explore about your latest volume. So I'd like to start with the obvious one. Why did you choose to write this particular book?
The classic. Well, I thought you were asking about the front cover, Ian. Well, why did you choose the front cover? But no, why this book? Well, this book is probably the third in what I'd call an accidental trilogy about Anglo-American relations. I did my first book about Reagan and Thatcher, which came out of my PhD. It was very much about the domestic policy, so monetarism, tax cuts, trade or labour union reforms, that kind of thing. It's not really like the sexy kind of Cold War stuff, which you could write about. In some ways, my first book was the classic example of a book that is great to have as a footnote, but even greater that you didn't have to write the book yourself. So that was kind of where it comes from. Then the second book, I broadened out to looking at the Irish dimension of Anglo-American relations. So it talks about US presidents and Northern Ireland. So how did US presidents get involved in the Northern Ireland troubles? How did they try to chevy along that kind of Anglo-Irish process, and then later the peace process? So I've got to broaden out there, and then in some ways, like the classic kind of end of the trilogy, I go back to Reagan and Thatcher. I'm just going to revisit them with a different spin on things as well. But in some ways, the book is actually the culmination of some thinking I've been doing over the last decade or so, where I've been thinking about different threads and ideas related to the overlapping nature of domestic politics and foreign policy.
Which I realise is a particular element of the book, which perhaps we'll move on to talk about in just a moment. But I notice from what you've said and reading the book that you've had a long relationship with the American presidency, and particularly with Ronald Reagan. So I think you would be particularly well placed to answer a question that's in my mind, which is whether Ronald Reagan was a great president. I mean, I remember living in the United States during the Reagan years, when in the kind of circles that I moved in, the sort of typical academic circles, he was often a kind of figure of fun. But I realise we now have a much more balanced, serious view, which is reflected in your book. So I wonder what your take on that. Was Ronald Reagan a great president?
I love these debates. And also, I'm fascinated by Reagan. The reason why I'm fascinated by Reagan is because I don't understand him yet. I don't fully get him yet. I don't think anybody ever really did or does, apart from Nancy, his late wife. In some ways, I think Reagan's kind of summed up best by those Saturday Night Live sketches, where on one moment he's kind of the friendly grandfather figure, and the next moment is kind of like was Machiavellian politicians. Kind of took extremes really of how people see Reagan. I think in some ways he may have been a bit of both. But in terms of what makes a great president, I probably agree with the great American historian H.W. Brands about this. And he talks a lot about this, especially in his public lectures, and I basically steal this idea when I'm talking to my students, where there's only been three great presidents in American history: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they're great because basically there's lots of big stuff going on. There's a crises going on. So Washington, of course, is the first one, has to set the tone, establish the United States, establish the early republic. That's a massive challenge. Lincoln, of course, he has the Civil War, and FDR has the Great Depression and then the Second World War. And in many ways, you don't want to be a great president because that would mean you've had to deal with a massive crisis. What you want to be is probably that next tier down, the second tier. And I think Reagan is probably at the top of that second tier. And Brands, and I agree with Brands naturally, is that second tier presidency is all about you basically win 2 terms, you change the discourse and the debate about American politics, and so you kind of leave your mark on American public life. And I think that's what Reagan did. I think Reagan's probably at the top of that. I think for Reagan, what he does is obviously wins 2 big election victories, and through Reagan, the discourse surrounding American politics is that it goes from government being a good thing, which has been the case since Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s, so now government becomes a bad thing, to put it simply. And like Barack Obama basically said similar things in 2007 when he was gearing up to run for the presidency. But there's a wonderful clip you can find on YouTube where he talks about how Ronald Reagan was, a real significant president because he changed the direction of America, like Roosevelt does, and he says how Nixon does not, Bill Clinton does not, but Reagan does. So who am I to disagree with the former president and of course the great Bill Brands? But in terms of Reagan as well, I'd say he really was a significant president, and he probably was transformative as well, most really in his rhetoric and his influence on the Republican Party, certainly until the Trump years. And also his influence on the Democrats as well, because in the 1980s, early 1990s, the Democrats to win, take back the White House, they became the New Democrats, which sees Bill Clinton, where they kind of repositioned themselves and find that third way, as it was known. Also with Reagan, I'd probably say he wasn't as bad as his opponents claim he was, or as wonderful as his proponents claim that he was. But the ideas he talked about and the ideas he's associated with become very prevalent in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, and that makes them a big deal. And the significance of Reagan, I think, is seen in the fact that until, again, the Trump years, till 2016, Reagan, even though obviously he passed away, he was still really the only kind of party elder that the Republican Party could discuss in election time. The Democrats could still talk about Bill Clinton. He could still come out and give speeches and so on, support candidates like Ted Kennedy as well, up until the first year or so of the Obama presidency. But of course, for the Republicans, they had Bush 41, who of course had won 1 term and lost. Although history, I think, has proven to be very kind to Bush 41 in terms of his foreign policy. But of course, you have Bush 43, George W. Bush, who's very divisive. And so it's almost like the party wants to keep him at arm's length very much in these elections in 2008, 2012, and 2016.
So not quite a great president, but a transformative and significant president.
Yes, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. But from my own work, which is kind of only really sort of brushed the surface of the character that's Ronald Reagan, but I'm very struck by the impact of Reagan in the 1960s in kind of establishing the shape of modern conservatism, modern republicanism in the United States. I think all the signs are there of a president of that kind of stature on the horizon, as it were, in the 1960s.
I think you're right, and I think that 1964 election is really significant. Because obviously have LBJ, don't you? Wins in his own right, massive mandate, great society. I mean, you'll know this more than I. This is obviously your field really. And then Reagan wins in '64 as well.
Yeah.
He becomes governor of California. He does what Richard Nixon failed to do previously, and also, of course, he uses this as a launching pad for the presidency. Of course, the big irony of his time as governor of California is actually he's quite liberal in many things that he does. So he talks the talk of almost like a Gold Water conservative, but what he actually does in terms of politics and policy in California is very liberal in many ways. But the fact he obviously was the governor of California, which is one of the largest economies in the world in its own right, the fact that he just taught the talk in that endorsement Barry Goldwater in 1964, he carries on. Talking like a real conservative. In '76, when he runs against Ford and almost unseats him as the Republican nominee. I think for Reagan, he's kind of shifting conservative politics. You are right, because Gerald Ford in 1976, he stops using the word daytime because of Ronald Reagan. Um, so I think you are right to note that in the 60s and into the 70s, Reagan's really significant.
Yeah. I mean, I think people look at the 1960s and what they think about is liberalism mostly. But I think maybe really the big political event of the 1960s in the United States is the emergence of modern conservatism, and that's being the standard bearer for that really is Ronald Reagan. It's what he says which is really important.
I think you're right. I think because obviously in some ways the 60s, the Great Society is kind of like that sequel, isn't it, to the New Deal?
Yes.
So obviously when LBJ he goes to he signs off the is it Medicare and Medicaid? He signs off that bill at the Truman Library.
With President Truman present.
Yeah, because obviously wanted to try and get it because Truman wanted to kind of do that as well in the 1940s after he succeeded FDR. But of course, what the Republicans do in the 60s, what they failed to do in the 30s and the 40s, which probably really come up with this alternative political view to liberalism. So I think there's a book in there reading for us.
Hey, maybe there is. Yes. Perhaps we'll talk about that. And there's another book there I noticed as well, because you said, well, you still don't really know Reagan. It sounds like you're going to have to write another Reagan book in due course at some point. The other side of this, of course, is that this most recent book is not just about Ronald Reagan. It's about Margaret Thatcher as well. And Thatcher is, I think a lot of Americans who, if they watch this video, might be quite surprised by this. But Thatcher is of course a hugely divisive figure in Britain. And I think most everybody has a view about Thatcher, and they're usually diametrically opposed. So I wonder, why do you think that Margaret Thatcher was such a divisive figure? And given that she certainly was in the UK, how did you and how do you, as a historian, navigate around that issue?
Yeah, I think you're right. She's very divisive. Often perhaps based on regionality matters. I think social class matters in this country. How you view Margaret Thatcher. So if your father or grandfather was a miner, you'd have a very, very dim view of Margaret Thatcher. Perhaps if you're in the north of England or south of Wales. But if you were in the southeast of England and your parents are in banking or something, as a young person, they probably wouldn't be that upset with Margaret Thatcher necessarily, unless your politics is on the left. I think with Thatcher, it's interesting because she was apparently so unpopular, even at the time, that nobody would ever admit to voting for her. So it's almost like there was a coup d'etat in Britain between 1979 and 1990. That for 11 years she was just, an autocrat, just took power as she wanted to. And I think you are right that Americans would find it surprising, because I think for Reagan, even if people did not like Reagan's policies or saw him as a figure of fun, I think folks in America, and I got this impression when I lived out there for about a year, is that people liked Ronald Reagan as a guy. They thought he was an all right guy. They liked him personally, and the fact that he made Americans feel good about being Americans again, especially after like the Vietnam era, Watergate, that kind of pessimism surrounding the Carter administration in many ways. But Thatcher, she was so confrontational. She didn't have any real humour. She maybe lacked that kind of likability that Reagan had. So I think she was very divisive. She was confrontational policies. She could seem quite stern in her policies as well. So I'm thinking about the miners' strike, where you had scenes reminiscent of civil war, really, in some parts of the country. Of course, you have the unpopular poll tax, the basically like local government kind of tax, which ultimately brings her down. She always ends up fighting with her ministers over Europe as time goes on, Britain's relationship with what's in the European Economic Community and so on. But I think also maybe Thatcher's like a hint of misogyny as well, where it would be one of those classic where he was a man who was a strong leader, or being so confrontational, he'd been seen as a strong leader. Where for Thatcher, she was the first Prime Minister. Time was very different in the 70s and the 80s. So there's a bit of hints of misogyny there too, but I think it was divisive, what she was trying to do. In some ways, what she was trying to do, she was doing too quickly. So even Milton Friedman, the father of monetarism, which was kind of her signature economic policy for the first few years, even he criticised, saying this is not what I wanted to see. It all went far too fast and so on. But in terms of how historians approach Thatcher, I think we have to recognise that she was a significant figure. And she clearly influences her successors, especially Tony Blair, you can argue. Especially when, if you think about how a lot of her economic policies continue, they remain. The new Labour government do not reverse any of these things, really. They don't reverse any of her trade union reforms. Also, under Blair, Labour bring in the idea of the free market into public services, which is probably in many ways Thatcherite. So this kind of legacy does go on. But historians, how we understand Thatcherism, there's obviously this growing literature, but as you say, there's growing debate about this. A bit like Reagan, where it starts off being quite biographical, and you get kind of like character assassinations, Valentine pieces. Then people kind of doing serious studies of her. Then now people doing studies of her policies, different aspects of government, from anything up to like the pension reform and so on, and privatisation. But I think historians are best, I would suggest, studying Thatcherism as a phenomenon of its time, and very much a response to a perceived decline in the 1970s, and a bit like Reagan, how Thatcherism was all about trying to restore economic strength and national prestige to Britain. But in terms of what is Thatcherism, I think there's a big debate among historians. In some ways, Thatcher wasn't the biggest Thatcherite. I mean, some people kind of believed her own policies and ideas more than she did in many ways. But also, I think a helpful way to look at Thatcher is to think of three Thatchers. You have what I would call Thatcher Zero, who was in opposition in 1975 to 1979. So she's leader of the opposition. She wants to become Prime Minister, and she's kind of finding her voice. She's really the Conservative leader because she's not Ted Heath, her predecessor. She's trying to find her feet, find her voice. Then in her first term, she's still very much reliant on what she called the Wets, people on all the centrist or the left of the Conservative Party. But then after the Falklands War and her 1983 general election victory was a big victory, she very much comes into her own. I'd suggest that's when you get the real speeding up of tax reform, privatisation, and so on. But then after the 1987 victory, I think you get Thatcher 3, which is where she gets, maybe I'd suggest respectfully to any fans of Thatcher, that she believes her own hype a bit. She buys into herself a little bit too much. She becomes very detached from her own cabinet, from her own party, and maybe from the public. And this is probably in the circumstances that bring her down in terms of the falling out over Britain's role in what become the European Union. And then, of course, the poll tax is very unpopular, sees her opinion poll ratings collapse, and her MPs basically kick her out. So, yeah, I think Thatcher's complicated, whereas Reagan's also complicated in terms of his first term, where I think it's a great political machinery around him. Second term, it all goes a bit wrong, so you get things like Iran-Contra. But I think historians increasingly look at the nuances of these characters and the people around them and how the policy developed. I hope that makes sense here.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I guess in many ways, Ronald Reagan is, and I think the book suggests this, complicated. It's just that he doesn't seem complicated because of his ability to communicate. So as far as the general public is concerned, that kind of folksy demeanour that makes him a kind of simple, open and shut person. But Thatcher is complicated, and I think that is a point you do bring through in your book, because you do make the point that in many ways she was actually rather more moderate and pragmatic than we sort of remember about her. So I think one has to tread carefully with her, which I think you have done.
I think you're right. She took him to the caricature in some ways, where the European single market, the massive trading bloc, Thatcher was an architect of that. She was really keen on this. So obviously, ironically, then we have Brexit, where very much Conservatives leading the way on this, wanted to leave this single market, which in some ways was Thatcher, as you could argue, one of her greatest international economic achievements. So it's very, it's just very complex, I think. Britain's relationship with Thatcher, and also our party's relationship with Thatcher as well.
Yeah, she's interesting. I think that's for sure. I certainly remember first coming to this university. This is, of course, a northern university, and I'm from the southeast, but not from a background who would find Thatcher very attractive. But even I was surprised by when she came up as an issue in some classes that I taught, at the hostility that students displayed towards her. So yeah, she's a tricky character, but very interesting.
I think in some ways the hostility might be probably in some ways a legacy of what I would say is the most significant change she brings about in terms of politics in the 80s, which is that until we get Thatcher, unemployment was just higher rates of unemployment bring down a government. Well, for Thatcher, she basically made the argument about interest rates and inflation. But actually, unemployment, that all kind of take care of itself, guys. But we need to keep interest rates and inflation down. Whereas previously, it was always a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, where we don't mind high inflation, we don't mind high interest rates as long as unemployment rates are low. So, of course, if you're in regions where unemployment will be high because you've had mines close or in other industries, manufacturing close, that's not going to help you out. If you've got money and interest rates are coming down, they're in the teens, weren't they? At some stage in the 70s and the 80s. But if they're coming down to 7-8%, things we couldn't dream about now, especially for a mortgage holder, you dread that now. But back then it was a big deal. The inflation coming down as well. So if you had a job and it was an all right job, you did all right out of Thatcherism. Plus, if you were able to, you could buy your own social housing. You could buy what we call council housing. And so some people, especially in the southeast, did very well out of this. It's over 20, 30 years. So I think in some ways that kind of like change in terms of how economics are viewed politically, and that kind of like property ownership. Some people well out about that person.
Yeah, and so here we're talking about, obviously this is a book about Anglo-American relations. That's a specialism of yours. So we're talking about Reagan on the one hand and Thatcher on the other. So that inevitably raises the issue, which I know you do talk about, of the special relationship. And of course, the big debate always is about, well, does it really exist? So I must ask you that question. Do you think that the Anglo-American relationship really is special?
It depends, which is almost a classic kind of historian's answer. I think sometimes leaders are very close personally, or they have a political affinity, sometimes less so. So obviously, Reagan and Thatcher, there is a personal affinity there. There is a broad philosophy. They do disagree about policy, especially when they're furthering their own interests. But also, like Richard Nixon really liked Ted Heath, but he wasn't that into him, which is quite weird. I mean, Heath, of course, was big on Europe, wasn't really an Atlanticist, but it's quite an unusual turn of events where the American president wants to be friends and you're not that bothered. But I think, regardless of what's happening at the top, the institutional relationship always endures. So there's always been intelligence sharing, diplomatic teaming up, if you will, and also the UK buys American nuclear weapons. So there's always that ongoing relationship as well. I'd say, if you want to use the word special, it's probably most special when there are overlapping interests. In the Second World War, we get FDR and Winston Churchill. In the Cold War, we get examples of Jack Kennedy and Harry Macmillan, Thatcher and Reagan. In the 1990s, where perhaps American foreign policy at the end of the Cold War turns under Clinton to dealing with kind of ethnic conflicts and peacemaking, you get, of course, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair being very close. So I'm thinking about Kosovo, Northern Ireland. But also you have the war on terror, of course. So in the 2000s, beginning after 9/11, so George W. Bush has a very close relationship with Tony Blair, which in some ways is a very strange relationship because of where they are in terms of politically in their own countries. But they're both very much buy into the idea of the war on terror. the idea there needs to be interventions to act on this issue. But of course, interests change. So after, of course, George Bush Senior, initially he's very keen when he comes in 1989 on cultivating a very close relationship with West Germany. West Germany becomes his focus. But then ultimately, especially with the first Gulf War, he realises that the Brits are perhaps more reliable. Gordon Brown, of course, he's keen not to be seen to be close to Bush 43. So when he replaces Tony Blair as the British Prime Minister in 2007, you can tell when he's around George W. Bush, he doesn't want to be so matey and friendly with him as Blair was, because obviously he's got his own domestic concerns and interests, where the fact that Blair was very close to Bush made him very unpopular, and Brown, of course, doesn't want that to happen to him. Brown, of course, then was desperate to be close to Barack Obama. There's that story where he's kind of chasing him around, the back rooms, like kitchens of a G7 summit, or trying to speak to him, or exchanging gifts, and getting Region 1 DVDs from Obama, and he gave him very kind of like a very personal, lovely gift. But in some ways, I'm sure Obama didn't dislike Gordon Brown, but his interests were he wanted to pivot America away from focus on Europe to Asia. Likewise, Donald Trump, when he was very keen to talk about Theresa May as his Maggie, because obviously he wanted to be seen as a Ronald Reagan type figure, and that Reagan wants to kind of bring about memories of that Reagan-Thatcher relationship. But of course, when Theresa May goes, he almost wants to make Boris Johnson his Churchill. So a lot of the times when I interview former politicians or civil servants, they kind of press home the same thing, and it's something which I think I've been convinced by now, is that yes, there's always emotional ties and history and shared culture, but ultimately Anglo-American relationships, it's driven by interests. Even at Reagan and Thatcher, which is seen as a classic example of a special relationship, as the book shows, if their interests aren't being served back home by that relationship, they will say so, and they will push back on that, especially Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, I mean, I think along similar lines that ultimately national interests win out. I guess what I might think about it, and I think this is what you're saying, is that it's not always special. It's only special when interests are aligned. But when that's the case, it's very special. My feeling about it.
I'll say like LBJ is your favourite president. You really like LBJ, don't you? But he didn't like Harold Wilson, did he? He didn't like Harold Wilson.
Not at all.
But his wife loved Wilson.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting itself.
Yeah, it's one of my favourite quotes from Lyndon Johnson is that when Harold Wilson was visiting, he complained to one of his aides that having Wilson come by was like having your mother-in-law come by when you were about to watch the ball game. So, moving on, the subtitle of your book is Reagan, Thatcher, and the Art of Summitry. And summits are meetings. They're just meetings. But they're not just meetings, are they? It's more complicated than that. So you talk about different types of summits. So how do you think these are used differently by world leaders?
Yeah, I love sort of. There's a classic television program, isn't there, in this side of the pond, where called Yes Minister, that becomes Yes Prime Minister. And there's a lovely moment where on the eve there's a funeral of a significant international dignitary happening, and I can't remember who it is, and the minister and the civil servant are talking about the funeral, and the civil servant says, the guests aren't coming for the funeral, they're coming for the politics. He calls it a working funeral. So in some ways, any kind of meeting can become a summit. So I suppose I talk about, I'm focused on the summits principally between, I suppose, the heads of government, so the American president, the British Prime Minister. There are some examples in the book of secretaries of state and so on as well with Thatcher. But there's all sorts. So you have obviously the bilateral summit, which is kind of one-to-one, where like the president will come to Britain and have a chat in Downing Street, meet the Queen, that kind of thing. So maybe part of a state visit. There's group summits like the G7, where the big industrial economic powers of the world, their leaders all gather. There's also kind of one-to-ones outside of these big set-piece summits as well, and plus, of course, the funerals. Also, I talk about the idea of shadow summitry, where in opposition, when you're not in power, you still go abroad to kind of develop ties and try and get good photo ops to make yourself look good, make yourself look like a leader in waiting and so on. I think in the 20th century, this big increase, don't you, of summits, because previously ambassadors did these things. Foreign policy was around for ambassadors or foreign secretaries or secretaries of state in the American case, because also the rise of transport, but also with the rise of mass media, the heads of government themselves want to do more and more of this themselves. I think sometimes that's about them wanting to be seen to be making a difference in the world and getting bigger wins, which can sell back at home. So summitry, I think, changes and evolves because of transport, because of media, maybe because of the ever kind of maybe the presidentialization, you could argue, of the British system. It was, of course, the word summit, of course, is coined by Winston Churchill, isn't it? He coins that word himself. But I think ultimately, when it comes to summits, they're used by leaders, I think, as the book hopefully shows, about furthering their own interests. Because ultimately, you may well be on the world stage at a G7, but as a prime minister or a president or whatever, you're not elected by a global audience, just your voters back home. So ultimately, the summit, I think, is another example of it's when a leader, a head of a government, goes abroad or meets international leaders to further their own country's interests or all their own political interests back at home.
Okay, so national and personal interests still come first.
Yeah.
Okay. You said at the outset that you were interested in the kind of interface between domestic politics and foreign policy. And that's clearly a feature of the book. It's a big argument you seem to be making is that there is a blurring between domestic politics and foreign policy. So in what ways does your research go beyond what other historians have said about the relationship between the foreign and the domestic?
Yeah, obviously, like in all things, you're kind of like standing on the shoulder of giants, really, where there is that kind of established body of scholarship about summitry, about the connection between domestic politics and foreign policy. And so this book is kind of like, I suppose, a classic case study trying to contribute in some way to that debate. And my claim's probably a threefold, where the first, the economic policy differences between Reagan and Thatcher perhaps more pronounced than some historians maybe have noted before. And this really kind of causes tensions at bilateral summits, where it's just Reagan and Thatcher meeting with their aides and so on. But also it can cause tensions where they have like their little spin-off meetings at the bigger meetings too. Excuse me. The second claim is that the importance really are attached to domestic issues before and during summits. So you'd think these summits are notionally about foreign affairs, so in this case like the Cold War or something like that, but actually domestic interests do come first, but also paradoxically at the same time the importance of political cover and support for each other come first too. So at the same meeting in 1981, when Thatcher goes to the Reagan White House for the first time, she's technically the second world leader, but she's the first major world leader to rock up to the Reagan White House. And in their public speech, especially when Reagan welcomes Thatcher to the White House, they're praising each other, being one of the same, trying to get government off the backs of the people, release the energies of the people, all that kind of stuff. This shared philosophy is coming through. But actually, behind the scenes, Martin Anderson is one of Reagan's economic advisors. He's distributing a handout to the White House press corps, highlighting the differences between Reaganism and Thatcherism in actual policy. And also Donald T. Reagan is in the Treasury Secretary. He's given a testimony to Congress. And again, he's saying that what we want to do as the Reagan administration, our Reaganomics or Reaganism, is different to what Margaret Thatcher's been doing the last 18 months in Britain. And a lot of this is because obviously they want to be able to say publicly, we're not crazy, we believe in the same things, therefore we can't be wrong. And they're giving political cover to each other to what they want to do domestically and in turn internationally. But also, the Americans are very conscious of the fact that New York Times, for example, is leading with stories about how raw Reaganomics leads to Thatcheritis. So they want to, basically calm everyone down, say, no, we're not going to have mass unemployment in this country. Interest rates aren't going to go through the roof, that kind of thing. But of course, it does. Excuse me. And the third contention is that this Reagan-Thatcher relationship is further problematized by the impact of globalization and the development and, crucially, the implementation of this globalization on domestic economic policies. In other words, the interconnectedness of the global economy. So international trade, capital flows, interest rates, and then perhaps broad political implications, ramifications, becoming a source of tension between Reagan and his allies. So often Thatcher might be caught between loyalty to her ally Reagan, but also having to say to Reagan, like others are saying, come on, your budget deficit is huge and it's causing big interest rates, which is causing a bigger problem for us in our economy. So I suppose overall I'm showing how summits that were ostensibly about international relations and security concerns really frequently masked attempts by Reagan and Thatcher to bolster their domestic position. So you talked about the book having the subtitle The Art of Summitry, but you could argue that maybe The Art of Summitry is just another example of the art of politics.
Yes, I think that does come over very strongly anyway, the influence of the domestic on the foreign. And the influence of economics. I think the book is very strong as regards its the economic foundation of the arguments. Very important point. This in your acknowledgements, you mentioned your chickens. What do they think about the Reagan-Thatcher relationship?
The chickens, Maggie and Nancy. They were a birthday present for my wife. She's always wanted chickens, so we got chickens. They were named after Danielle's idea, actually. They're named after Ron's number one ladies. Perhaps his number one, number two lady. After Nancy and Maggie. They were very vocal during the lockdown on online teaching and meetings and so on. So I'm sure Ian, you might remember fondly hearing the chickens.
Oh yes.
At times. So I think I'm not quite sure about what their views are, but I think they're very vocal in making them. So if I could speak chicken, I think I'd have a better grasp. But they're certainly very vocal about their views. But hopefully, but that seems like their names. So
Right.
and they keep laying lots of nice eggs. So hopefully they're happy enough.
Okay, seems like they might be Reagan-Thatcher fans then. And also, like the first question, kind of inevitable next question, or last question really, is where, and I think I know something about this actually, where do you think your research will go next?
It's going with you, Ian. It's with you. I think obviously I'm trying to have like kind of like a holistic approach from understanding politics from politics, kind of the messiness really of politics, and this kind of led to an interest in grand strategy. And so obviously the two of us we're working on a project about JFK and his grand strategy, which I think is obviously nicely timed because we are currently in the 60th anniversary of his administration. Kennedy's very sidelined in the grand strategy literature for a variety of reasons. So hopefully we'll complete the project whilst we're still in the anniversary of Kennedy's administration. But it's certainly something which I'm very much enjoying working with you about, because you are the guy, aren't you, when it comes to kind of studying the 1960s. So hopefully, well, I'm sure we'll do a great project, because I think what we're going to do is we're going to be problematizing the issues, events, decision makings, which kind of like overlapping all these different areas for Kennedy. So the foreign, the domestic, and which in some ways is unusual because obviously grand strategy, in some ways military historians kind of lead the way, don't they, in grand strategy, and they're talking about materials and power. And in some ways, obviously, this is, in many ways, this is your influence in the project, where we're talking about other issues such as Kennedy's image, aren't we, and so on. So how is Kennedy using all the tools at his disposal to achieve his aims? So hopefully that'll be coming to bookstores in the next couple of years for folks. via our good friends at Edinburgh University Press.
Well, that's what we hope. That's where we're going next, then. And thank you so much for talking about the book. I found that very interesting. And thanks again.
Thank you, and I think now I'll go and buy you a coffee.
Oh, thanks for that too.
Okay, cheers, mate. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.